Welcome to the controversial statements by the Apostle Mark E. Peterson video. All right, Mark E. Peterson was an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, from 1944 to 1984, so for 40 years. And over that time frame, he said quite a few amazing things. And we're going to go over a lot of those things in this video. All right, so what did the Apostle Thomas S. Monson think of Peterson in 1984? Well, he tells us in the Ensign magazine. Monson went on to become the prophet. He says, "Here and there and now and then, God makes a giant among men." See the picture above. Such a giant among men was Elder Mark E. Peterson. But not everybody agreed with Monson. One of the people that disagreed with him was church historian Leonard J. Arrington. And how do we know this? Because he talks about it in his journal. On January 13, 1984, Arrington, in his journal, called Peterson a bigot or bigoted and narrow-minded. So why did Arrington call him a bigot? Well, we're going to find out in this video. We're going to go through a lot of statements of things Peterson has said about that. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about his narrow-mindedness. And of course, Arrington is pictured above. All right, Arrington made another comment about Peterson in his journal, this time October 26, 1986, in a section that he entitled "My Experiences as Church Historian, Number One Biggest Disappointment." And it was not being consulted on historical matters. Well, who is to blame for that? Not consulting Arrington on historical matters. Arrington blames Elder Mark E. Peterson. Interesting. Peterson was always suspicious of educated people, especially historians. So Peterson was not a friend of the historians, and Arrington did not like him. Peterson was always suspicious of educated people. He just wanted people to, teach the run-of-the-mill church education to the people. Didn't really like educated people or historians. All right, so shortly after Peterson's death, Arrington made another entry in his journal. This one was January 13, 1984. Arrington says, "I have had a real concern that Peterson might become the president of the 12 or eventually the president of the church." He's got a real concern about that. Now, after his death, at least, that will not happen. He won't become president of the 12 or president of the church. That will not happen. The Lord has preserved us from that kind of leadership, the kind that Arrington doesn't like. Why doesn't he like it? Well, you're going to see in the rest of this video of all the controversial statements that Peterson has made. And of course, we pictured above another picture of Arrington. All right, the first statement here by Peterson was supposedly took place in a stake conference in Seattle, 1975. Somebody put this online. I'm not able to definitively prove that he said this because it's kind of a random post on the internet. But according to this person, Peterson says, "I have been married to my wife for 44 years, and never once have I seen her body uncovered." So his idea of the law of chastity, very strict, very orthodox. Never once did he peer upon his wife's naked body. All right, this statement was a speech that Peterson gave entitled "Modesty Protects Virtue." This was given in the officers' meeting of the Annual Relief Society General Conference, 1962. I'm much more confident about this statement being accurate. So yeah, contributing to rape culture. Peterson did this a lot. If you look at the sign above, the lady is holding a sign, "My outfit is not an invitation." Well, not an invitation for what? Well, for rape. You can't blame rape on the way women are dressed. You blame rape on the rapist. So let's see what Peterson says here. What tempts the boys to molest the girls today more than any other thing is the mode of dress of our girls. That's what tempts them to molest them. The mode of dress of our girls. Such sights are placed before their eyes, the boys' eyes, almost like an invitation. An invitation to what? Rape them? Can you blame them, that is the boys, can you blame them any more than you would the girls who tempt them if they take advantage of those girls? The girl is just as much to blame as the boy because of the way she dresses. Well, this is very controversial nowadays, and this kind of statement is what has built up the rape culture that we have in our society today in 2020. All right, another topic where Peterson made some pretty amazing statements is masturbation. He wrote a famous letter. It was presented as a letter in the Mormon Missionary Guide of 1970. It was entitled Steps in Overcoming Masturbation. Helpful Hints on How to Stop Masturbating by Peterson. He says, and we're going to go over quite a few statements in this guide. This one, he says, be assured that you can be cured of your difficulty. The difficulty of masturbation. You can be cured of it. So in other words, masturbation is a disease. All right, so let's get to his bigotedness. Peterson gave an amazing speech entitled Race Problems as They Affect the Church. BYU speech, August 27, 1954. Somebody recorded it on some kind of a device, I guess, and then transcribed it and circulated it in the underground market, and a lot of people read it, to the embarrassment of Peterson. So we're going to go over quite a few statements out of this speech. Here's the first one. Peterson says, I would be willing to let every Negro drive a Cadillac if they could afford it, but let them enjoy these things among themselves. Let's not integrate with them. We're not going to ride in the Cadillac with them, but it's nice to know that Peterson would be willing to let every Negro drive a Cadillac if they could afford it. So like I said, this speech got circulated in the underground market, the Mormon underground, they call it. And like a lot of documents, we owe Gerald Tanner, we owe him because he's the one that published it on a more wide basis. He got a hold of the speech and published it with the Utah Lighthouse Ministry, much to the chagrin of Peterson. Peterson was on a mission at the time in the West European Mission, and he wrote a letter to Gerald Tanner threatening to sue him if he kept circulating it. Sue him for libel, I guess. But the speech was true. Nothing in the published speech was untrue, so Peterson later decided not to sue the Tanners. All right, next controversial topic is homosexuality. Peterson wrote an editorial in the Church News. He wrote a lot of these in the Church News over a long period of time. He was the writer of all those editorials in the Deseret News, in the Church News. This one is entitled, Is It a Menace? And he's talking about homosexuality. Is it a menace? He's going to tell us. This was in 1979. He says, The persistent drive to make homosexuality an accepted and legal way of life should disgust every thinking person. That it should be accepted and a legal way of life should disgust everybody. Homosexuality is a menace to the population at large. So, very controversial statements nowadays. All right, another statement regarding rape or rape culture. Again, this was in the annual Relief Society General Conference 1962. Peterson says, "We must face the fact that more and more American women are unwittingly inviting sex crimes." They're inviting it. Really terrible language. At least one half of the rape cases could have been avoided had the victim shown more discretion and good judgment in dressing modestly. Half of the rape cases could be avoided. So he's basically blaming half of the rape cases on the way that the women dressed. That's what he blames it on, half of them. All right, quick little statement here about the Kinderhook Plates. Peterson gets this wrong. This is from his book, These Gold Plates, in 1979, and he wrote a lot of books. I think like 40 books. And we've gone through a bunch of them for this video, a bunch of those books. But anyway, he says, there are the Kinderhook Plates 2 found in America. Most experts agree that they are of ancient vintage. Kinderhook plates are of ancient vintage. Well, that is not true. They were found out to be a fraud later on, I guess after 1979, or else Peterson would have known about it, I guess. They were, the Kinderhook plates were put together by some men who scratched these kind of symbols into these bell-shaped plates to fool Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith actually did give a partial translation of them. But then later on, they found out that these men were tricking Joseph Smith, and they just scratched in these random characters into these plates in the 19th century. They are not of ancient vintage, and I did a whole video about this that you can go watch on the Kinderhook plates. All right, so let's go back to the race problem speech in 1954. Who was the one that segregated the Negro? Well, it wasn't man, it wasn't us. It was the Lord. According to Peterson, he says, I think that the Lord segregated the Negro, and who is man to change that segregation? Segregation was right. Segregation was commanded of the Lord. Very controversial. All right. One of the books I went through was entitled Our Moral Challenge. I think it was written for the youth. 1965 book. Peterson labels homosexuals as depraved deviates. He also says that their lifestyle should be illegal. All right, and another idea here that was very common before, like 1970, very common in the church to say that our purpose is to become gods. They don't say that as much anymore, if at all. But Peterson talks about this in his book, Toward a Better Life, 1960. He says, only those who prove themselves will ever become gods. So, just interesting to note that they used to talk about this a lot. All right, so back to the race problem speech. Of course, but before 1978, blacks, or the Negro, as Peterson calls them, could not have the priesthood in the church and could not go to the temple. And therefore could not be saved in the highest kingdom of glory. He says in this speech, we, and he's talking about white people, must not intermarry with the Negro. The white people must not intermarry with the Negro. Why? If I were to marry a Negro woman and have children by her, my children would all be cursed as to the priesthood. The curse would come upon your children because it'd be partially black or maybe half black. Do I want my children cursed as to the priesthood? And he would say, of course not. No, we do not. So do not intermarry with the blacks. All right, so the big question in the universe is, are we alone? Well, an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ gives us the answer to one of the most intriguing questions that mankind has ever asked. And this is why I used to like the church, you know, in my early 20s, I guess, because I thought that they were giving answers to these kinds of questions. No matter what questions we had, they could answer them. And now I've come to find out that most of the answers were BS. But Peterson says here in his book, Faith Works, in 1963, of course other planets are inhabited. Yay. There should be no doubt about that. Joseph Smith knew about space and about inhabitants on other planets. Jesus lives on another planet, so I guess Jesus and God live on a planet that's near a planet called Kolob. All right, another controversial statement here in his book, Toward a Better Life. He says, the leaders of our church have said that they would rather see their children dead and in their graves clean than have them live unclean lives. And he's talking about the law of chastity here. No necking, no petting, no fornication. Rather than do those things, it's better to have your child die and bury them. All right, so who receives the curse of the black skin? Well, Peterson says, if there is one drop of Negro blood in my children, they receive the curse. Anybody that's got one drop of Negro blood receives the curse. They cannot have the priesthood. They cannot go to the temple. Well, the church ran into a lot of difficulties determining who has drops of Negro blood in their system. Hard to determine, hard to decide where to do missionary work. But this is pretty controversial. All right, so if you have to choose between breaking the law of chastity or sacrificing your life, you should sacrifice your life. You should die. That's why they say the parents would be rather bury their child than have them commit fornication or heavy petting. So this is again from the book Toward a Better Life. Virtue is more important to you than your life. Protect it above your life. If the time ever comes when you must choose between the two, then sacrifice your life. If you can choose, give up your life. So if the rapist is going to kill you, you just fight back, even if he kills you, and maybe you could protect your virtue by fighting back. Probably not. But then sacrifice your life, but under no circumstance sacrifice your virtue. All right, a statement here about abortion from his book, Our Moral Challenge. Peterson says that abortion is an evil sin, and he calls it murder or murderous. Well, that's the shedding of innocent blood, which in the Doctrine and Covenants says is an unforgivable sin that you will go to outer darkness for. Shedding innocent blood. And Peterson says abortion is murder. Certainly the fetus is innocent blood. So in the old days of the church, I guess, there's no forgiveness for that. Nowadays, the church says you can be forgiven of abortion and still make it into the highest kingdom. But interesting to hear him talk about it as murder. All right, so again, more tips on what you can do to stop masturbating. It's pretty hard for the young men, isn't it? And that's why 90% of young men or more, whether Mormon or not, masturbate. Peterson is just banging his head against a brick wall here. This is a pretty funny one. He says, it may be necessary to tie a hand to the bed frame with a tie in order that the habit of masturbating in a semi-sleep condition can be broken. You got a bad habit, tie your hand to the bed frame. Not going to be very comfortable to sleep that way. All right, another amazing statement about rape. He says, most cases of rape today are direct results of miniskirts. Most cases of rape today are a direct result of miniskirts. This is Peterson quoting Paul Harvey in his book, For Righteousness' Sake. All right, some more interesting revealed information from Peterson here in his book, Abraham, Friend of God, 1979. Where does God live? Well, he says, the throne of God is on a separate planet in the sky, with Kolob being nearby. We showed that picture on a previous slide. God and Jesus are on this planet by another planet called Kolob. Fascinating, hey? All right, so should we open our arms and embrace the Negro? Well, according to Peterson, I guess not. He says, we must not allow our feelings to carry us away regarding intermarriage, nor must we feel so sorry for the Negroes that we will open our arms and embrace them with everything we have. We should not do that. We should not feel so sorry for them that we will open our arms and embrace them with everything we have. All right, so what is sex for? For a married couple, what is it for? Well, he says it is not for pleasure, even though that is a direct result of sex, a lot of pleasure. That's not the purpose for it. You're not supposed to be seeking pleasure. In his book, The Way to Peace, 1969, he says, sex is for the procreation of the species, not for sensual pleasure. Ah, bummer. All right, so Peterson talks about alcohol here in his book, Toward a Better Life. No person can use alcohol even in the mildest form and retain a keen-edged spiritual purpose. Nobody that uses alcohol can have a keen-edged spiritual purpose. I think that is hogwash. About half of the adults in the world drink alcohol on a regular basis. So what's Peterson saying? Half of the world, half of the religions in the world have no spiritual purpose? It's hogwash, and alcohol in its mildest form would be beer, I would think. And if you look in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, it almost says that you can drink beer. Depends on how you interpret this passage. But it says that barley is for all useful animals and for mild drinks. Well, what's beer made out of? Barley. Barley is for the use of mild drinks. So is that beer? Well, we know that Joseph Smith drank beer. So that's just kind of an interesting side note. Doctrine and Covenants, section 89, verse 17. All right, so we have to change our entire life, our entire lifestyle to avoid masturbating. Another one of his ideas is to avoid being alone as much as possible. So you're not able to have alone time. because that's when you're going to masturbate. All right, another statement about rape culture in For Righteousness' Sake book, 1972. Women's dress is responsible for much of the sex crime now so rampant. So I'm just giving multiple examples of this. He talks about it plenty of times. What is responsible for the sex crime now so rampant? Well, it's the way that women dress. All right, so another very controversial subject here in his book, A Faith to Live By, 1959. Peterson supports spanking children. Now, there's been a ton of research come out since 1959 explaining how damaging it is to beat or spank your child. But Peterson gets his ideas from the Bible. He quotes from the Bible in Proverbs, 4 scriptures in Proverbs, supposedly written by King Solomon. The first one is, "He that spareth his rod hateth his son." Rod is, of course, a stick, I guess, of some kind to spank your child. Next one, "The rod of corrections shall drive foolishness far from him." So correct him with a rod. Next one, "Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die." That's a very controversial one. "Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die." Well, that's not the only thing you're concerned about. You're also concerned about damaging your child's psyche. Another example here where modern day scientific study disagrees with the Bible. And the last one here, "Thou shalt beat him with a rod and shall deliver him from hell." So there you go. Peterson supports spanking children. You probably never hear about this from modern day general authorities. All right, so here's an example. We have a mom spanking the child reacting very dramatically. All right, so what flag will be flying in heaven, if there is a flag? Peterson's going to tell us. What language will we speak in heaven? Well, Peterson will tell us. The xenophobic Peterson. This came from a Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought article, Thoughts on Latino Mormons, 2017. Pretty recent. In the article, a person says, "I once heard that Apostle Mark E. Peterson said that the American flag would fly in heaven." So there you go. All the other flags of the world, you're out of luck. When you get to heaven, you're going to be saluting the American flag. We are the most favored country out of everybody, right? And that we would all speak English in our celestial home. Well, won't that be nice? We're all going to speak English. This is Peterson just being very xenophobic, favoring his country over all other countries. Wouldn't we have telepathic thought so we could just speak to each other in our minds? All right, back to the book, Our Moral Challenge. Peterson says that homosexuals are vile, reprobate, unrighteous, wicked, malicious, full of murder. I don't know where you get that one. And malignant. He says that such sinners, that is, homosexuals, are worthy of death. Doesn't get much more controversial than that. Homosexuals are worthy of death. This is Peterson quoting the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1. So again, if you want to go to the Bible for some really controversial statements, statements that have been disproven by science. All right, so in 1954, what were the favored countries, or what was the favored country? Well, according to Peterson, it was the United States. You didn't want to be born in Africa or China or India. Those places are less desirable. But since they're less desirable, why did God send some people to those other less favored countries and then other people to the United States? Well, he tells us in his race problem speech, we can account in no other way for the birth of some of the children of God in darkest Africa or in flood-ridden China or among the starving hordes of India, while some of the rest of us are born in the United States. And here he tells us what it is. We cannot escape the conclusion that because of performance in our pre-existent lives, some of us are born as Chinese, some as Japanese, some as Indians, some as Negroes, some as Americans, some as Latter-day Saints. And the Latter-day Saints are the most chosen, the most lucky of them all, and then the Americans are next. It's because of your life in the pre-existence. You earned the privilege of being born in the U.S. You earned the privilege of being born white and being born a Latter-day Saint. All right, again, he talks about planets being inhabited other than the Earth in his Abraham book. Are there other planets which are inhabited, he asks. The answer to that, of course, is affirmative. Yes, there are other planets with people who look just like us because we're all the children of God. All right, so there is something called the Church News. It's in the Deseret News. It's a Utah newspaper. And in 1978, the blacks received the priesthood by the church. The first time they announced this in the Church News was June 17, 1978. In that issue, they announced authorization of the priesthood for those of black African descent. But in that edition of the Church News, there was another article right next to it under the headline, Interracial Marriage Discouraged. So they're saying, yeah, they can have the priesthood, but we still don't want you to marry them. Blacks and whites should not get married. Sources at headquarters indicate that Apostle Marky Peterson required this emphasis. He required this article, Interracial Marriage Discouraged. And here is that short article that appeared in that edition of the Church News. Interracial marriage discouraged. They quote from the president of that time, President Spencer W. Kimball, several quotes from him saying that blacks and whites should not intermarry. Now, this edition of the Church News should not be confused with the front page story on the Deseret News cover. The announcement in the Church News was 8 days after the Deseret News broke the story on the front page. And then I guess the next edition of the Church News was 8 days later. All right, the next controversial subject here is birth control, or limiting the number of children you have. This is Peterson quoting the prophet David O. McKay in the book The Way to Peace, 1969. He says, members of the church who are healthy and normal should not be guilty of restricting the number of children in the home. You should not restrict the number. You should just have as many as God wants you to. Well, I'm pretty sure that very few Mormon families do that anymore. All right, back to masturbation here. If you are associated with other persons having the same problem, you must break off their friendship. Well, if you're a boy, 90% of your friends are going to be doing this, so you're going to have to break off your relationship with 90% of your friends. Doesn't sound very enjoyable. All right, another statement here about intermarriage in Toward a Better Life. Peterson says, people should not marry out of their race, neither should they marry out of their faith. All right, so Peterson says that homosexuals are not born that way, and they should not be accepted as they are. Basically just saying the opposite of what he should say. This is from the book, The Way to Peace. How utterly blind they are. How gullible are those who sympathize with the idea that deviates or homosexuals were born with these tendencies. How blind and gullible to believe that they are born with these tendencies and therefore should be accepted as they are. We should not accept them as they are. They are not born that way, according to Peterson. Well, science has disproven that. All right, so again, talking about the choice spirits getting to come to America and getting to be white. This is Peterson quoting Joseph Fielding Smith in his book, The Way to Perfection. This is in his race problem speech. Is it not a reasonable belief that the Lord would select the most choice spirits to come to the better grades of nations, like the U.S.? Is it not reasonable to believe that less worthy spirits would come through less favored lineage? And he's mentioned who those are: the Negroes, the Asians, the Indians. All right, birth control is in direct opposition to the plan and laws of God. Well, why do all the modern Mormons use it then? This is again from his book, The Way to Peace. In this birth control effort all around the world, man places himself in direct opposition to the plan and laws of God. Man, think of how many people we would have without birth control. The environment would even be more polluted. All right, so Peterson quotes the psychiatrist Melvin Anchel in the book For Righteousness' Sake, 1972. And Anchel is saying that sex education, I guess, in the schools causes homosexuality. These are just crazy statements nowadays that we know better. So this is what it says in the book. I haven't had a pervert, and of course perverts are homosexuals. I haven't had a pervert yet that I have cured. Well, the Mormon Church can do it. We're going to get to that. The answer is in prevention, and sex education, paradoxically, doesn't prevent homosexuals, but it causes it. Sex education causes homosexuality. Bizarre stuff. All right, some more information that I found in a book by Matthew Harris and Newell Bringhurst. The book is entitled The Mormon Church in Blacks, came out in 2015, about 5 years ago. Looks to be a very interesting book and pretty honest. Talks about Marky Peterson and some other apostles who wanted to prevent black citizens from moving into white neighborhoods in Utah and California. So it's just amazing the things that these guys were involved in, wanting to prevent black citizens from moving into white neighborhoods. So it says in the book, in the 1940s and 1950s, George Albert Smith, I think he's an apostle, J. Reuben Clark, he's an apostle, and I think he was in the first presidency, and Marky Peterson encouraged local LDS leaders to join and support ordinances and organizations that would prevent black citizens from moving into white neighborhoods in Utah and California. All right, so preventing masturbation. Again, do not admire yourself in the mirror. Never stay in the bathtub more than 5 or 6 minutes. Well, baths can be very relaxing and enjoyable. And taking a 5-minute bath is it's just so fast. He says, when you bathe, do not admire yourself in a mirror. Never stay in the bath for more than 5 or 6 minutes. All right, marrying our own kind. Someone of your own race. Do not marry outside your race, according to Peterson in a talk called A Proper Orientation on the Threshold of Life, a BYU speech in 1962. We should marry only our own kind. I mean someone having the same religion and someone of our own race and of the same standards. Only our own kind. Well, Slipknot came out with an album called We Are Not Your Kind. All right, other Earths, other planets. Are we alone? Again, he tells us in Abraham, his book, Abraham. No doubt many other Earths are mortal like ours and have on them human beings like ourselves. They must look like us because we are all the children of God. So there's other Earths, other planets. They're mortal like us, humans like us, and they look like us. All right, a Peterson talk in General Conference, April 1969. He's talking about sodomy. Well, what is sodomy? If you look it up on Google, it says that it is sexual intercourse involving anal or oral copulation, anal or oral sex. Peterson says that sodomy is a perversion that will cause destruction and death. So you're going to have to limit your sex life, even if you're married. No sodomy, no anal, no oral. All right. So Peterson talks about having sex in a marriage. This comes from his book, Marriage and Common Sense, 1964. He asked the question, does anything go in the bedroom? Does anything go in the bedroom? Anything does not go in marriage. Perversions are perversions whenever indulged in, and the marriage ceremony cannot take away their stain. So you're not allowed to do whatever you want in the bedroom when you're married. Anything does not go. You can't commit perversions. He doesn't tell us exactly what those perversions are, but we can guess from other information that we have from Peterson, like we had on the last slide. When indecency, indignity, and unnatural practices are thrust upon a good woman by a lustful man, can she be blamed for resisting? So he just sets up the idea that it's going to be the man that goes after the woman in his lustful practices because he wants to practice unnatural things. The woman doesn't come after the man wanting to practice unnatural things. So what is he talking about here? Perversions, unnatural practices, indecency. Well, I think he's talking about the same thing as sodomy, or in other words, oral sex and anal sex. You are not allowed to practice those in your marriage. And another statement here, why some people are white, some black, some are smarter, some are dumber, has to do with the preexistence. He's again quoting Joseph Fielding Smith in his book, The Way to Perfection, 1943. Peterson says, does this preexistence not account in very large part for the various grades of color and degrees of intelligence that we find in the earth? So you're white because you did good in the preexistence. You were not neutral. You were on God's side. So you're white and not black, white and not American Indian or Chinese. And also you're probably smarter because of your valiance in the preexistence. All right, Peterson quoting the prophet David O. McKay in the book For Righteousness' Sake. The use of contraceptives is to be condemned, and that is for both married and unmarried couples. Well, condoms, a type of contraceptive, sure does eliminate a lot of disease and unwanted pregnancy. So All right, so we should not mix with other nations, with other faiths, or with other races. We should just stay in our own little communities, our own little tribes, and not venture out. This is in his book, Toward a Better Life. By mixing with other nations, with other faiths, and with other races, they would destroy the great ideal that the Lord had in mind. The ideal is whites with whites, blacks with blacks, Mormons staying with Mormons. In other words, the Lord does not like diversity. All right, so back to homosexuals. Peterson says that homosexuals are perverts, sinners, shameful, and deviates. He says that homosexuals are much to be pitied. All right, Peterson talking about a teaching of the prophet Spencer W. Kimball. This is from Peterson's book, Marriage, Covenants, and Conflicts, 1977. It's interesting to note that almost all of these books are no longer available from Deseret Book. It's not hard to figure out why as we go through this video. But Peterson says the prophet Spencer W. Kimball has pointed out that people are happier if they marry within their own race and within their own church. And we had some quotes in an article in the Church News from Kimball. All right, steps in overcoming masturbation again. Message going out to 90% of the male youth, and probably a pretty good percentage of the females too. When in bed, dress yourself for the night so securely that you cannot easily touch your vital parts, your genitals or your penis, which they never like to say, and so that it would be difficult and time-consuming for you to remove these clothes. Maybe dress in layers. So it's harder to touch your vitals. Too difficult and too time-consuming to get all those clothes off. All right, so Peterson talks about God engaging in racial segregation in the Book of Mormon, which, of course, if you've ever read the Book of Mormon, you know is true. Again, this goes back to his speech on race problems. Was segregation a wrong principle? In placing a curse on Laman and Lemuel, God engaged in segregation. What was the curse? It was the dark skin of the American Indians. When he placed the mark upon Cain, that's the black people, he engaged in segregation. So there you have it, right from an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, that God engaged in segregation in the Book of Mormon, also engaged in it with the curse of Cain in the book of Genesis of the Bible. All right, so Peterson quotes the prophet David O. McKay on birth control again. McKay was the prophet during the 1950s and 60s. Love realizes its sweetest happiness and most divine consummation in the home, where the coming of children is not restricted, where they are made most welcome. So don't restrict the size of your family. All right, so in Peterson's book, Toward a Better Life, in a chapter called Conformists and Nonconformists, Peterson condemns freethinkers, nonconformists, and individualists, all condemned. People like me, who are freethinkers, don't like to conform, value their individuality, do not want to be told what to do by a church. Apparently, Aristotle said, be a free thinker and don't accept everything you hear as truth. Be critical and evaluate what you believe in. All right, so Peterson says that tight and revealing clothing is just as disgusting on men as it is on women. That's right, Iron Maiden. Your tight leather and spandex pants showing your cod pieces is disgusting. All right, so steps in overcoming masturbation. if you follow Peterson, you're probably going to gain a lot of weight. You're going to get up in the middle of the night and fix yourself a snack. If the temptation seems overpowering while you are in bed, get out of bed and go into the kitchen and fix yourself a snack. Even if it is in the middle of the night, and even if you are not hungry, and despite your fears of gaining weight, well, you're going to have the desire almost every night to masturbate. If you haven't masturbated for a long time, trying to hold it in. Almost every night you're going to, instead of masturbating, you're going to go have a sandwich or a snack out of the fridge. Even in the middle of the night, you're going to get fat. All right, Peterson in the Church News editorial is saying again that homosexuals are not born that way. That idea is ridiculous. In his article, his editorial, Sin is No Excuse, 1978, many homosexuals claim that they are what they are because they were born that way. Yeah, that's true. And they cannot help it. How ridiculous a claim. All right, back to race problems. And, Peterson gets a lot of this stuff from the scriptures. Racism is in the Book of Mormon. It's in the Pearl of Great Price. It's in the Bible. The ideas of segregation in the Bible, in the Book of Mormon. As far as this kind of stuff goes, the church has had to go against the scriptures. Peterson had the bravery to go with the scriptures, even if it was unpopular. When the Lord told Enoch not to preach the gospel to the descendants of Cain who were black, the Lord engaged in segregation. When he cursed the descendants of Cain as to the priesthood, he engaged in segregation. All right, back to birth control. And I give a number of examples here so that people can't say, oh, that was just only one time. That quote was taken out of context. Well, if I give 5 examples, the proof stacks up. This is from his book, For Righteousness' Sake again. The doctrine of 1 or 2 children to the family is contrary to the revealed instruction of God, all in caps. That's Peterson's emphasis there, all in caps. The doctrine of 1 or 2 children to the family is contrary to the revealed instruction of God. So what would Peterson prefer? No birth control at all? And so that people are having 12 children? All right, so what about petting? Touching another person's body, and maybe even their vitals, as Peterson would say, their genitals. Well, of course, petting is evil. He talks about this in Toward a Better Life. Petting is one of the most pernicious things that ever came into the world. So very pernicious. But you can pet in a responsible manner. Petting by itself doesn't cause pregnancy. You can pet in a way that you don't get diseases. All right, so here's another funny one about masturbating. Never read about your problem. Keep it out of your mind. Well, if we really follow Peterson, then we cannot read his missionary guide, Steps in Overcoming Masturbation, that he wrote. Never read about it. Does that include what Peterson has said? All right, so Peterson likes to talk about homosexuality being a criminal offense worthy of death. He talked about this in General Conference in April 1969, a talk entitled The Dangers of the So-Called Sex Revolution, where he said homosexuality was made a capital crime in the Bible. Well, what is a capital crime? You can ask Google. A crime that carries the possibility of a death sentence. So that's what Peterson the Apostle thought of homosexuals, that their crime could be or was worthy of death. All right, Peterson, again, quoting from the Bible, or talking about the Bible. When God forbade intermarriages, as he does in Deuteronomy chapter 7, he established segregation. So it's God who forbids intermarriage. All right, he tries to scare people over and over and over again about venereal disease, sexual diseases. This in our Moral Challenge book, but he does this all throughout his books. He loved to talk about these social sexual diseases, using that as a scare tactic to get the youth of the church to be chaste. Peterson says that venereal disease can make you crippled and cause you to go insane. But if you do a few searches on Google, you can find out that with the invention of penicillin in 1928, long before this time, and other antibiotics, this should not happen today. You're not going to get crippled, you're not going to go insane, but he uses these things as scare tactics. All right, some more information from the Mormon Church and Blacks book. Looks to be a very good book. Might have to read some more out of there. In 1954, Lowell Benyon, the progressive Mormon or the liberal Mormon, heard the Apostle Peterson say that if he had his way, he would restrict blacks to a limited area in Salt Lake. So, segregating blacks to their own neighborhoods. If Peterson had his way, he would restrict blacks to a limited area in Salt Lake. All right, masturbation again. Do not pray about this problem. Keep the problem out of your mind by not mentioning it ever. Do not mention it ever. Do not read about it. Don't think about it. Don't pray about it. Don't even read the steps in overcoming masturbation. I'm sure that will solve your problem. All right, so Peterson quotes some wrong experts, some bad science. This in an editorial in the Church News entitled "The Strong Delusions." What were they deluded about? Well, whether or not homosexuals are born that way. This is 1978. He's talking about an article in the Sacramento Bee in 1977. He says, in the article, they gave expert evidence that homosexuals certainly are not born, they are made. So that's bad expert advice. They're made, further diffusing claims that they can't help it. So in other words, the idea that homosexuals can't help it, that they're born that way, that is a false claim according to Peterson. All right, again, birth control here. Wanting Mormon families to have large families. It's a recipe for depression for the mother, who a lot of the responsibility falls on, as the father is busy doing church work over in the chapel every night if he has a high calling. Having large families. That's the only way to be. Not to have careers, not to have no kids. Losing your free agency. If the woman wants to work out of the home, she doesn't want kids, she loses that freedom of choice if she follows what these guys were saying at the time. And you're supposed to follow what the apostles say. So he says, Peterson says, have not the prophets of the church taught from the beginning of our history that large families are to be desired? Have not the saints been advised by those prophets not to limit their families? Not to limit, in capital letters. That's Peterson's emphasis there. Having these big, huge, giant families that you're responsible for. That's a recipe for depression, for women that don't really want to do it. All right, so it was God that put the Negroes in Africa. He segregated them in Africa, according to Peterson. Who placed the Negroes originally in darkest Africa? It's interesting how he says darkest Africa. Who put the Negroes there? Was it some man or was it God? And when he placed them there, he segregated them. So he answers the question, it was God. He placed them in darkest Africa and he segregated them. That's why Peterson was against integration during this time frame. All right, little statement here about homosexuals in Virtue Makes Sense book, 1973. He asked the question, does legalizing of homosexuality or other forms of immorality cleanse those perversions of their filth? He would say no. Homosexuality is still immoral. It is a perversion. It is filth. All right, Peterson quoting the prophet Joseph F. Smith in Our Moral Challenge book. Peterson really likes Joseph F. Smith. He says, I would rather take my children to the cemetery and see them buried in innocence than I would see them corrupted by the ways of the world. All right, so Peterson compares necking and petting to the plague. This from the book Faith Works! Avoid necking and petting as you would a plague. Yes, kissing your girlfriend is pernicious, dangerous, and similar to a plague. All right, more about masturbation. Masturbation is a sinful habit. It is a sinful habit that robs one of the spirit and creates guilt and emotional stress. Yeah, because you're telling most of the young men of the church that they're evil. Most of the missionaries of the church that they're evil. Probably a lot of the missionaries are masturbating. So they're, according to Peterson, the missionaries of the church do not have the spirit and can't teach the gospel effectively. All right, a quick one here about the Chinese people. Who placed the Chinese in China? The Lord did. It was an act of segregation. All right, so in the 1960s, people like Peterson did not want any homosexuals at BYU, the church-owned school. This is an interesting entry in Ernest L. Wilkinson's journal. He was the president of BYU during this time. He made an entry on May 21st, 1959 in his journal. He said, Wilkinson, along with Spencer W. Kimball and Marky Peterson, decided in 1962 that as a general policy, that no one will be admitted as a student at the BYU whom we have convincing evidence is a homosexual. So, back in the 60s, Wilkinson, Apostle Kimball, Apostle Peterson didn't want any homosexuals at BYU. All right, the famous statement here by the prophet Heber J. Grant, and we're kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but Peterson quotes the prophet Grant in his book Our Moral Challenge, and he talks about this a lot, about burying your child rather than having him break the law of chastity. Grant is pictured above in his younger days. Peterson says, there is no true Latter-day Saint who would not rather bury a son or a daughter than to have him or her lose his or her virtue. He's quoting Grant. All right, so does the church really want you to make your own decisions about important matters in your life? Or does it just give you the proper path to follow? Well, this gives you a little bit of an idea here in Peterson's book, Why the Religious Life, 1966. Much as the Lord stresses our free agency, no matter how individualistic we may seem, he still requires obedience from us. So that's it in a nutshell, people. You're required to obey the leaders of the church over your free agency. The church leaders are trying to get people to obey, not do what they want, and the church maps out your whole life for you. All right, so Peterson tries to get the young men and some young women to use thought-stopping techniques. That's a technique that cults use. So it's interesting that he recommends this technique here in regards to masturbation. When the temptation to masturbate is strong, yell, "Stop!" and then recite a pre-chosen scripture or sing an inspirational hymn. Also, when you get doubts in your mind, try these thought-stopping techniques. Recite a scripture or an inspirational hymn. Stop the negative or doubtful thought and keep your belief. All right, so in the 1970s, people were concerned about overpopulating the planet, and we're still concerned about it. And the number of humans we have on the planet has caused a lot of environmental degradation and pollution, and it still is a serious issue, and we need to look for alternative energy sources, etc. But for Peterson, none of these things are a problem because the apocalypse is just around the corner. So this is what he says in his book, For Righteousness' Sake, 1972. We must realize that indeed we are living in the period closely preceding the second coming of Christ. We're living in the period closely preceding the second coming of Christ. And of course, the early leaders of the church talked about this a lot, that the second coming was just around the corner. This earth will not survive long enough in its present state to become so overpopulated that we will all starve to death. This earth just won't survive. It's right around the corner. And it's going to be basically blown up. All the evil people are going to be burned. So why worry about overpopulation? And this is how we get ourselves into a host of difficulties like climate change and global warming. Okay, another editorial in the Church News, 1977. This one is entitled Unnatural Without Excuse. And of course, he's talking about homosexuals. They're unnatural. They have no excuse, I guess is what he's trying to say. In the editorial, Peterson says that homosexuals are evil, repulsive, and disgusting. He says the practice of homosexuality is severely condemned by Almighty God. People should keep this evil from spreading. So, not the most positive messages to our LGBT youth. All right, back to race problems. Being cursed with a dark skin. Peterson says, the Lord himself placed a dark skin upon them, that is, the Lamanites and the Negroes. He placed the dark skin upon them as a curse, as a sign to all others. He forbade intermarriage with them under the threat of extension of the curse. So you intermarry with a black person or an American Indian person, the curse extends to your children because they get that dark skin as well. All right, Peterson, of course, says that necking or kissing is an evil sin. That's right, kissing is an evil sin. All right, so Peterson also talks about those who peep and mutter, like in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 19. Those who peep. What about people who peep into a stone, who have a peep stone? Well, Peterson doesn't think about that. So this is in Why the Religious Life, 1966. Peterson says, Latter-day Saints could well be susceptible than others if they voluntarily seek those who peep and mutter. Well, you can probably think to yourself, if you know a little bit of LDS history, that Joseph Smith had a peep stone, and the LDS people sought after him because of his pretended power to look into his seer stone or his peep stone and find buried treasure, and then he also used that to translate the Book of Mormon. They turned to an evil power for inspiration or for a thrill. He doesn't think of Joseph's peepstone here, though. And then also the prophet Joseph F. Smith in 1902 said, these peepstone men and women are inspired by the devil and are the real witches, if any such there be. So there, Joseph F. Smith also forgets that Joseph Smith also used a peepstone and was involved in occultic practices, trying to find buried treasure. So those who look into peepstones are condemned, but they forget about Joseph. All right, so what else can you do to stop masturbating? Peterson says, if you are tempted to masturbate, think of having to bathe in a tub of worms and eating several of them. Yuck! Comparing masturbation to a tub of worms and getting in there and bathing with them, is that really going to stop you? All right, another editorial in the Church News, The Strong Delusions. It's about homosexuals again, 1978. The idea that God made homosexuals that way and that they are powerless to change is a complete fabrication and a deep delusion. Of course, God didn't make homosexuals that way, right? It was their environment, according to Peterson. For it was the Lord who provided the death penalty for these people in ancient times. So again, what do you do with homosexuals? According to Peterson, you simply execute them. All right, more race problems here. Peterson says, God certainly segregated the descendants of Cain when he cursed the Negro as to the priesthood. God segregated them. God drew an absolute line. You may even say that he dropped an iron curtain there. What, an iron curtain between the blacks and the whites? Do not intermingle, do not intermarry. All right, kind of a strange one here in our Moral Challenge book. Peterson says that couples who smoke cigarettes are less likely to have children. Of course, according to the Mormon way of life, that's a sin not to have children. So couples who smoke cigarettes are less likely to have children. I seriously doubt that. All right, so some of the Mormon youth, I'm sure, masturbate in the showers, in their shower. So Peterson says, take a cool, brief shower. Cold water and brief. All right, so should we respect the LGBT community? Well, it seems like an obvious question, but not to Peterson. Again, in the Church News, 1978, an editorial entitled Calling the Kettle Clean, Peterson calls homosexuals unclean. Their lifestyle is debauchery. They form their own political groups and seek to compel the public to respect them. Duh. Who doesn't want to be respected? They form their own political groups and seek to compel the public to respect them. So we shouldn't? He then refers to Leviticus chapter 18 and 19, which talks about executing homosexuals. All right, back to race problems. The Negro was cursed as to the priesthood, and therefore was cursed as to the blessings of the priesthood. Certainly God made a segregation there. All right, so you cannot have a successful life without the Lord Jesus Christ, according to Peterson. All you Buddhists, all you Hindus, all you people of other religions, all you Jews, you just can't have a successful life because you don't believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. Peterson says, you can never live successfully without the Lord. So many have tried, but all of them have failed. All right, Peterson talks about Lucifer in the book A Faith to Live By, 1959. Peterson says that Lucifer can appear as an angel and he can perform great miracles. So this becomes very confusing for a Christian. If you see an angel, how do you know whether or not it's Lucifer? If you got Jesus and Lucifer side by side and they're both performing miracles, how do you know which is which? It becomes very confusing to a true believing Mormon. And pictured above, we have the actor in the show Lucifer. All right, back to masturbation. Wear pajamas that are difficult to open. Maybe a onesie, huh? All right, another Church News editorial, 1979. Is it a menace? He's talking about homosexuality. Is it a menace? Question mark. In the interest of protecting the rights of all the people, homosexuality should be classed not only as a threat to the rest of the population, but as a crime which can and does involve many others, bringing distress, sorrow, and corruption in its wake. All right, so what did Peterson think about academic freedom? Something that I think is a very important principle. Well, he gave an address to religious educators in 1962, probably people in the CES system. He says, in teaching the gospel, there is no academic freedom. So if you're a seminary teacher, you are to be a robot. You are supposed to spit out what they tell you to spit out. Go from the manual. Don't give your own opinions. Don't speculate. When you're teaching the gospel, there is no academic freedom. How boring. There is only fundamental orthodox doctrine and truth. What about people that are more progressive, that are more liberal, that are less orthodox? Well, Peterson didn't like those kind of people. All right, so Peterson talked about the Chinese people, kind of denigrated them. A Chinese born in China with a dark skin, really not that dark, and with all of the handicaps of that race, seem to have little opportunity. So the Chinese have a lot of handicaps in their race. They seem to have little opportunity. Well, they have a lot more now in 2020. In spite of whatever they might have done in the preexistence to justify being born over there as Chinamen, if they now in this life accept the gospel and live it, they can achieve exaltation. Isn't the mercy of God marvelous? All right, so Peterson also did not like teenagers driving around in cars. Too tempting to break the law of chastity. But this statement here is kind of a strange one. Students who use cars freely have lower grades. I don't know where he comes up with this BS. Students who use cars freely have lower grades. All right, a little bit of sexism here in the book Toward a Better Life. The woman is the helpmeet of the man. The woman is the helper of the man. Why doesn't he say the man is the helper of the woman? She is given to the man. He would never say the man is given to the woman. The woman is given to the man. All right, back to race. Peterson says, think of the Negro cursed as to the priesthood. This Negro who in the pre-existent life lived the type of life which justified the Lord in sending him to the earth in the lineage of Cain with a black skin, and possibly being born in darkest Africa. All right, sex sin being next to murder. He talks about this all the time, over and over and over. Sex sin is next to murder. The one crime that stands next to murder is the crime of sex sin. All right, back to race problems. I think this is a continuation of 2 slides ago. If that Negro is willing when he hears the gospel to accept it, he may have many of the blessings of the gospel, in spite of all that he did in the pre-existent life. So he's kind of lived a neutral life or somewhat of a sinful life in the pre-existence, but he can have many of the blessings of the gospel. Okay, here is the clincher. If that Negro is faithful all of his days, he can and will enter the celestial kingdom. He will go there as a servant, but he will get a celestial resurrection. So this is a very controversial statement. If he's faithful, he can go to the celestial kingdom, but he will go there as a servant. But he will get a celestial resurrection. Well, of course, they don't talk this way anymore. All right, so Peterson also liked to talk about science verifying the existence of God, which it does not. He says, true science has rediscovered God. Only the pseudoscientist denies him. But he doesn't give much evidence at all to show this. True science has rediscovered God. Oh, really? All right, so Peterson talks about the Lamanites becoming a white and delightsome people, because that's what it talks about in the Book of Mormon. He says, what about the removal of the curse? We know what the Lord has said in the Book of Mormon in regards to the Lamanites, that they shall become a white and delightsome people. That is, if they're righteous, they keep the commandments, follow the Lord. The curse of their dark skin can be removed, and they can become a white and delightsome people. See the picture above. All right, so some of the boys who have moral downfalls say that it was because of the way girls or women were dressing. They were dressing immodestly. So Peterson says, some boys have told me that their moral downfall began with a girl's immodest dress. Then pictured above, we have, my short skirt is not an invitation. So again, Peterson contributing to rape culture. All right, back to race problems. I know of no scripture having to do with the removal of the curse from the Negro. But there was for the Lamanite, I guess, going from dark to white, but not for the Negro. I think that we should not speculate too much about that. We should not try to determine on our own what the ultimate end of the Negro is going to be. So this was in 1954. He was probably pretty surprised when the blacks got the priesthood in 1978 under the prophet Spencer W. Kimball. All right, another statement that I think is BS. You can look this up on Google and do your own research. But in his book, The Way to Peace, he says, public sex education in the schools increases promiscuity. I don't think that's true. It might prevent or protect kids from getting STIs. All right. If a boy or a girl comes to me claiming to be in love with a Chinese or Japanese or a Hawaiian or a person of any other dark race, I do my best to talk them out of it. Even if they're really compatible, even if they're totally in love, even if they're both Mormon, Peterson does his best to talk them out of it. Do not, if you're white, do not marry a Chinese, a Japanese, or a Hawaiian, or any other dark race. All right, another funny one here. Peterson says that women should not expose their knees to the admiring public. Ooh, how scandalous to show your knees. And of course, the garments go down. I don't know if they're past the knee or they at least go down to the knee. All right. I tell them that I think the Hawaiians should marry the Hawaiians, the Japanese ought to marry the Japanese, and the Chinese ought to marry the Chinese, and the Caucasians should marry the Caucasians. I teach against intermarriage of all kinds. All right. Peterson says that teenagers should not use birth control like the pill. Well, then they're going to get pregnant. And then he also denigrates teenagers who get pregnant. So you can't have it both ways. You know, you're going to have a lot with no contraception, no pills. You're going to have a lot more unwanted children. Okay, so what can we compare pornography to? Pornography. Well, Peterson compares pornography to cancer. Yikes. Cancer is so serious. Cancer kills so many people. But pornography is just as bad, according to Peterson. And, of course, Peterson does not like the hippies. This is 1969, so kind of probably the tail end of the hippies. In his book, The Way to Peace, Peterson does not approve of the hippies with long hair. All right, so Peterson did not like women who worked outside of the home, especially if they have children. Their job is to stay at home, raise as many children as possible. Don't use birth control, so you're going to end up with like 12. They are not to have careers. So taking away their free agency. Maybe in the 70s more Mormon women stayed at home. But nowadays, due to economic conditions, about 70% of Mormon women work. So the church has failed in this effort. But yeah, Peterson just likes to take away your free agency. You're not allowed to date other races. Whites are not allowed to date other races. Don't use contraception. Don't drive around in cars. Don't masturbate. Homosexuals are not allowed to be homosexuals and have any kind of sexual relations with the same sex. So you're just taking away all of your free agency. So here he says, the character of the nation suffers irreparably due to women who work outside the home. All right, Peterson compares pornography to poison and says that it increases the crime rate. Well, it has not increased the sex crime rate. It's probably what Peterson is talking about, rape and molesting of children and that sort of crime. That is not increased. All right, again, so in Patterns for Living book, he says there's only one way to live your life. There's only one way, and so that pretty much strips out all of your free choice. The only way to happiness is through living the gospel. That is the Mormon gospel. That is the only way. Hold to the rod. All right, Peterson seems to think that the prohibition of alcohol should never have been repealed. Read about this in For Righteousness' Sake, 1972, page 114. Prohibition of alcohol should never have been repealed. Well, talk about increasing the crime rate. Gangsterism, bootlegging. All right, so what about card playing? Well, I remember Bruce R. McConkie saying that card playing is evil. Well, Peterson was saying it too even earlier. And I guess Joseph F. Smith was saying it even before Peterson, because Peterson here is quoting the prophet Joseph F. Smith. This is in the book Your Faith and You, 1953. Peterson says that card playing is evil, pernicious, and dangerous. Those who thus indulge are not fit to administer in sacred ordinances. Wow, all that just from playing cards. All right, so not only cards, but you're not supposed to play pool or billiards either. Just taking away more and more options here. Your Faith in You, 1953 again. Young people will do well to avoid billiards or pool. Also, do not get a tattoo. Every Latter-day Saint boy in the service, in the military, or out of the service, should resist the temptation to tattoo his body. Okay, childless marriages are generally unhappy ones. This contributes largely to the divorce rate of the nation. So he's saying if you don't have kids, your marriage is not going to be happy, most likely, and you probably get a divorce. Well, according to some recent studies, actually the opposite is true. They have discovered that generally married couples who do not have kids are more happy than those who do have kids. Kids put a lot of stress on a relationship. There's a lot of financial responsibilities. Teenagers act up. They use drugs, etc., etc. So this was found in Your Faith in You, 1953. And it's kind of funny, on the back of this vehicle, having kids equals a lot of money. All right. In regards to artificial methods of insemination, the saints have been told to avoid such things, that the practice is not moral. You can find this kind of stuff in the church handbook, which is now available on the internet. I did a video, I think it was entitled 58 Reasons Why You Don't Want to Be Mormon, and a lot of the stuff in that video I got from the church handbook, and I think artificial insemination was one of those things. All right, there are widows' mites, small amounts of money that widows have, which are being contributed to the church today. Even in their poverty, they delight to contribute of their means to the upbuilding of the kingdom of God. This is right. It is right that these poor widows living in poverty, or other people living in poverty, it is right for them to pay 10% of their income, of their money, to the church in tithing. And then there was something even more dramatic in the Ensign magazine in 2012. You can read this above here. If paying tithing means that you cannot pay for water or electricity, pay your tithing anyway. If paying tithing means that you cannot pay your rent, still pay your tithing. Even if paying tithing means that you do not have enough money to feed your family, still pay tithing, because the Lord will not abandon you. And on this slide, it says the LDS Church has $32 billion in the stock market. We now know the Ensign Peak Fund has more than $100 billion of cash in it. They no longer need the widow's mites. All right, another BS statement here in the book, Faith Works, exclamation, 1963. If the world were left to good mothers, if good mothers ruled the world, I guess, which ironically, the church does not let them rule in the church. They're not allowed to have high positions in the church. They're not allowed to be general authorities. But if the world were run by good mothers, there would never be a war. There would never be a delinquent child, nor an alcoholic, nor a drug addict. Talk about nonsense. People have their freedom of choice. Doesn't the church realize this? People can still make war. We're still tribal people. There's still scarcity of resources. Still problems that arise, even with being the world run by good mothers. Children can choose to be delinquent. They can choose to drink alcohol. They can choose to use drugs. All right, so who should become a great mother? He tells us again in Faith Works. Every girl. There you go. Freedom of choice gone. Every girl should strive to become a great mother. Even if you're not interested in it, even if you wanted to become a doctor or a lawyer, whatever. All right, Peterson says that the Mormon Church is the answer to every problem which faces us. Sorry, Buddhists. Sorry, Islam. Sorry, Hindus. Sorry, Jews. You just don't have the answers. The Mormon Church has the answer to every problem. The place of the mother is not out earning the bread and bacon. The place of the mother is not out earning the bread and bacon in a career. Well, tell that to the 70% of Mormon women now. All right, another statement here about birth control. This is Peterson quoting the prophet Joseph F. Smith in the book Marriage, Covenants, and Conflicts, 1977. So quoting Joseph F. Smith, Joseph F. Smith said, I think it is a crying evil that there should exist a sentiment or a feeling among any members of the church to curtail the birth of their children. Now, I interpret that as being birth control. Members should not curtail the birth of their children. I think that is a crime. I believe this is one of the greatest crimes of the world today. He also could be talking about abortion here too. But basically, you're supposed to have a lot of children and have a nice big family. All right, another statement here about interracial marriage and marrying people of your same religion. He says that the prophet Spencer W. Kimball has pointed out that people are happier if they marry within their own race and within their own church. He has urged that Catholics would find most harmony by marrying Catholics, Baptists by marrying Baptists. So you shouldn't marry out of your race or out of your religion. All right, Peterson talking about women's liberation. Same book here, Marriage, Covenants, and Conflicts. Peterson says that liberated, quote-unquote, women commit more crime. All right. The highest goal of true womanhood is motherhood. The highest goal of a woman should be motherhood, basically is what he's saying. Don't worry about what your dreams are. So don't dream big. Only dream of motherhood. That's your only path. That's your only goal. Motherhood, motherhood, motherhood. So your dreams, your individualistic dreams, don't worry about that so much. Set your goals to be a good mother. Take action, be a good mother. The highest goal of true womanhood is motherhood. All right. In a chapter entitled Selecting Your Mate, Peterson asks the following question. Is there a racial problem which might rise to haunt us? So when you're selecting your mate, think of any racial problems which might rise to haunt you. So why does he ask that question? Because he doesn't believe in interracial marriage. Then he asks another question, are there differences of economic levels, religion, or race which sooner or later will take their toll? The fact that you're different races sooner or later will take their toll on your marriage. All right, Marriage and Common Sense book, 1964. What couples should have children? Well, Peterson tells us certainly all couples should have children within legal wedlock. Some people don't want kids. It's just as simple as that. But if you're a Mormon, you're basically required to have kids. All couples should have kids, so then you go against what you want. And then you resent your kids. Whenever you say all or every or only, you're leaving out some people. So, and with that, we will conclude the video. This is the most comprehensive resource ever put together on all of the controversial statements made by Peterson. Went through a lot of different books. There's still more to go through. If somebody else wants to find more, go through more books that I didn't mention. But as it is today, this is pretty comprehensive, and it's interesting to see all the different statements Peterson made throughout the years in all of his different editorials, all of his different books. But that is going to do it for this video, and I thank you for watching the controversial statements made by Apostle Marky Peterson video.